Do you ever think about those Depression-era meals that kept families alive when hunger was a daily fear? Those meals stretched almost nothing into enough to keep a household going. What does it mean that nobody cooks them anymore? Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. When the cupboard was empty and the garden was dust, you made rag soup. Well, they did not boil actual rags, praise heavens, but because this soup was made from the scraps so lowly that it was like throwing rags into a pot. Rag soup was made from water, a couple of carrots, or any other vegetable that was left rotten and, at most, a piece of meat or a bone if one were to be lucky. It was thin, hardly spiced, and was stretched to go around the whole family. You can consider it as the soup where the idea is more important than the substance. The beauty of rag soup was that it was a very versatile dish. Got a carrot and a potato? In they go. Found a pinch of salt? Jackpot. It was a meal that was prepared in a time of famine and at the same time creativity. And though it was simple, it gave heat and food during the worst conditions. Rag soup is evidence of the fact that Dust Bowl families were able to survive and cook something tasty even out of the scraps. Carrot tops, the lost greens that were anything but lost during the Dust Bowl. When fresh vegetables were out of season, nothing was thrown away, not even the green tops of carrots. Carrot top salad made these usually discarded greens into a rather healthy meal. The greens were chopped, dressed with vinegar or lemon juice, and combined with any leftovers of vegetables or wild greens that could be found. If you were really fancy, you might add some more olive oil or a dash of salt. The result? A sharp, sour dish that was anything but luxurious, but was instead a nutritionist's dream. Carrot tops have a robust, somewhat pungent taste, so they are considered a luxury item in today's terms. However, as they say, when the going gets tough, the tough get eating, and Dust Bowl families were certainly tough. Fun fact, carrot tops are not only edible, but also rich in nutrients such as vitamin K and other vitamins and minerals. I'd like to try this salad, perhaps, if there is enough dressing to offset the bitterness. It is not something I would run for, but I do appreciate the creativity of using leftovers to get food. If there is one thing that the Dust Bowl did, it showed that although survival may not always be pretty, it is always impressive. Pickling was a common practice during the Dust Bowl, and when you're not sure whether you'll wake up to a fresh harvest of fruits, preserving them is the way to go. And what's a better way of preserving fruits than pickling them? I mean, you could dehydrate nature's sweets, but picking is a whole lot tastier. Pickling involves soaking fruits in a mixture of vinegar, salt, and spices. Fruits like apples, peaches, and even cherries were pickled with sugar and vinegar to create a sweet and tangy treat that could last throughout the year. These pickled fruits were often enjoyed as a side dish or used to add a bit of sweetness to other meals. It's crazy to think that pickled fruits were one of the only sweet treats available during the Dust Bowl era. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Cornmeal drop dumplings in broth were a warm meal born from desperation and a little genius. When meat was scarce and soup looked too thin, a quick cornmeal batter could save dinner. You'd mix cornmeal with water or milk, pinch off little balls, and drop them into bubbling broth to puff and soak up the flavor. They came out soft, dense, and delicious, tiny golden pillows floating in the pot. The smell of simmering broth filled the house, carrying a quiet promise that everyone would eat tonight. It was the kind of recipe that stretched the smallest pot of soup into something that could feed a family. Some added onions or pepper, others just relied on the broth to do the heavy lifting. Either way, it worked. Cornmeal drop dumplings didn't just fill bellies, they lifted spirits. They were proof that a handful of meal and water could turn hunger into gratitude. Everyone knows that potatoes are a comfort food, but during the Dust Bowl, even the potato plant was used in ways that would make today's food bloggers cringe. Enter boiled potato vine soup, an ingenious creation that's about as far from the baked potato as you can get. It is the potato plant, the vines of which became an important food source when all other sources were depleted. The vines, which are normally thrown away, would be collected by the farmers, washed and boiled in water to make a soup. The broth was not very rich and had an earthy taste. Nothing special, but it would keep a man alive when he had nothing else. The vines also have nutrients that could sustain you, but it was more of a survival thing rather than something you'd want to eat. The soup was accompanied by what else was available, or perhaps one or two remaining vegetables or a pinch of salt. While today we may crinkle our noses at potato vine soup, it was a blessing during the Dust Bowl when any green and growing thing was fair game. At times, it is not about exotic tastes, but about survival of the fittest in this case being food. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Biscuit dough pizza boats turned canned biscuits into dinner for a crowd. You'd flatten each one into a little bowl, spoon on tomato sauce from a jar, sprinkle shredded cheese, and maybe add a slice of pepperoni if you were feeling fancy. Pop them in the oven and watch as they puffed and browned, smelling like pizza night on a dime. Kids loved them because they were small enough to hold, and parents loved them because they cost next to nothing. They looked cute, tasted amazing, and disappeared before they even cooled. It was the kind of meal you could make out of leftovers and pantry scraps without needing a recipe card. The 1980s were full of little tricks like this, turning store-brand dough and canned goods into a moment of joy. Biscuit dough pizza boats weren't just food, they were a celebration of what imagination could do on a shoestring budget. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Remember when I said cornmeal was dirt cheap during the Dust Bowl era? Plus, it was almost everywhere, especially if you lived in Missouri or Kansas. Well, cornmeal mush was something Meemaw made every time we needed a nice, fulfilling meal. Think of it as the instant oatmeal of the Dust Bowl days. You just cooked cornmeal in water until it reached a thick, porridge-like consistency. It was often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar. Some folks even added a little molasses for extra flavor. Cornmeal mush was an affordable way to keep hunger at bay and provided a good source of energy. It wasn't a five-star meal, but it was dependable, much like the comfort of a warm blanket on a cold night. Meats and chicken were too expensive, so people had to make do with veggies like corn. Three-bean baked beans were one of the best hits to come out of wartime cooking. They were a great source of protein, easy to grow, and readily available. Plus, a pot of these beans would set you and your entire family up for the rest of the day, and probably the next one too. You really wanted recipes that didn't have a lot of specifics. You know those recipes on food blogs where if you substitute one or two ingredients, use what you have on hand, and call it a day, it falls apart? Yeah, that was not the vibe here at all. If we're talking about the themes of wartime cooking, three-bean baked beans show us all of them. An adaptable recipe with ingredients you can find everywhere for cheap with a lot of crowd-pleasing ability. Basic beans like navy, kidney, and lima beans were used. If you were in the South, you'd probably see a lot more of black beans, which were actually given a little more credit. Any gym rats watching should note that they're better for protein. Not only was it really easy to make and prepare, it was also really comforting to hit. That goes double if we're talking about winters. And man, those winters were really harsh. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on. Especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. Rolled oat meatloaf was another way people made do when meat was a rare luxury during the Depression era. The idea was simple. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find, so they became the backbone of many loaves when ground beef was scarce. Housewives would combine rolled oats with onion, a little broth or tomato juice, and perhaps an egg if one could be spared, then bake it until firm. The oats took on the flavor of the few seasonings and drippings that were used, giving the illusion of meat even if very little was present. If there was any beef or pork to add, it stretched further thanks to the bulk of the oats. Served with gravy made from pan drippings or even a thin tomato sauce, it could feel hearty enough to pass for the real thing. Many families came to appreciate the flavor and comfort it provided, even without meat. Pancake batter corn dogs were the carnival you made when you couldn't afford the fare. You'd mix up a bowl of pancake batter, slice hot dogs into chunks, and spear them with whatever you could find: forks, chopsticks, or even straws. Then came the best part: dipping each one into the batter and dropping it into hot oil until the outside puffed up and turned golden. The smell alone could make the whole block jealous. Sweet, crispy, and greasy in all the right ways, they were chaos turned delicious. Families made them on Friday nights when they wanted to give the kids something fun without spending anything extra. Sometimes they dipped them in syrup, sometimes in ketchup, Sometimes both. There were no rules. You could fry 10 of them for the cost of one real corn dog, and everyone got seconds. They were crunchy on the edges, soft in the middle, and gone in minutes. Pancake batter corn dogs were a reminder that joy didn't need money. It just needed a little imagination and a lot of hot oil. In a world that felt hard, these golden bites brought a little laughter back to the table. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy-breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. No, this isn't a prank. There really was a dessert called sawdust pie, and people really did make it during the Dust Bowl. And yes, sawdust was used. Okay, not the sawdust in the literal sense, but the breadcrumbs or other leftovers that created the dry and crumbly feel of the pie. It was made sweeter, flavored with spices, and baked into a product that looked like a dessert. The main ingredient was frugality. Staple ingredients such as flour and sugar were rationed, and therefore cooks had to make do with available ingredients. Breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even ground nuts, if one had been fancy, became the base for this pie. A little molasses or syrup added, and you'd have a dish that might not win the bake-off but can do the job of satisfying a craving in the middle of the night. The name sawdust pie alone would turn anyone's stomach, but it was actually food and, I must admit, rather creative. It was not about opulence. It was about turning the essence of food into a dessert, literally a crumb. Today, there are still recipes for sawdust pie, but they use coconut and pecans to make it a little bit more fancy. Would I try it? Of course, if someone says it is the new style and not the original straight from the Dust Bowl, because even a pie that goes by the name of sawdust needs a bit of appreciation, doesn't it? Carrot marmalade was a sweet spread that helped families feel like they had something luxurious for breakfast, even in the toughest years of the Depression. Sugar was precious, but when it could be managed, grated carrots simmered down with citrus peel made a bright orange jam that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Citrus itself was not always available, so many recipes leaned heavily on the carrots, using peel or extract when possible. The finished marmalade was thick, fragrant, and easily spread across homemade bread or crackers, turning simple staples into something that felt festive. Children loved its sweetness, and parents appreciated how it stretched a handful of carrots into enough jam to last for several mornings. Many community cookbooks published carrot marmalade recipes, encouraging families to rely on what they could grow in gardens. It was a dish that turned scarcity into creativity, and for many households it became a small comfort that brightened otherwise plain and repetitive meals. Fried potato peel chips proved that nothing went to waste in the thrifty kitchen. When you peeled potatoes for dinner, you saved every strip, rinsed them, and threw them into a hot pan of oil until they curled and browned. Sprinkle salt, and suddenly you had the crispest, saltiest snack imaginable. It was crunchy, earthy, and satisfying in a way that store-bought chips could never match. Poor families knew better than to toss good food away, and this snack was living proof. Kids would snatch them from paper towels while they were still warm, mouths burning, but too happy to care. It was the kind of food that made the kitchen smell rich even when you had nothing fancy to cook. Fried potato peel chips were a masterclass in making something from scraps, turning the parts others threw away into a reason to smile. Fish soufflé and baked potatoes were a wonderful combination, the kind of thing that just bounces off of the beach of its different parts and sides. The fish soufflé, along with a generous serving of baked potato, wasn't just delicious, it was also extremely nutritious. This was probably one of the recipes that kept up health the most throughout the whole ordeal. You might be wondering how fish was common enough for the recipe to have this kind of weight behind it. It just so happens that if you lived near a coastal city back then, you were definitely in luck, at least compared to the rest of the population. Fishing skyrocketed, not as a hobby this time, but as a necessary skill. Fish were plentiful, and most of all, they were free. They were the main source of nutrition for a lot of places. When people had no use for fish as food, they'd sell it to make some quick money and get whatever necessities they needed. Besides, it was common enough to get things like crab in the waters back then too. Hoover's stew got its name from President Hoover, who was blamed for the economic hardship of the 30s. It was a hodgepodge of whatever ingredients you had on hand, thrown together in a pot and cooked until it was tender. It might have included meat, potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables, and was a way to use up leftovers. The hot dogs provided protein, the canned vegetables added some much-needed nutrients, and the pasta helped to bulk up the dish. Hoover's stew came about during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Folks had to pinch a penny so hard they'd make Lincoln cry, as they used to say. This stew is a tasty way to stretch $1 to feed more people or to make a meal with enough leftovers to take care of the next day's meals. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. Don't underestimate the versatility of cotton. It is not only used to produce clothes. When the Dust Bowl hit, farmers learned that they could take cottonseed, no joke, it's a byproduct of cotton cultivation, and make a loaf of something that could be eaten. Cottonseed loaf was the ultimate frugal meal, the idea of turning what was essentially waste into the main course. Cottonseed was poisonous and had to be cooked to remove the poison, Then it was ground and then added to flour, water, and whatever spices and leftovers people had. It's sort of like a meatloaf's distant relative, only there is no meat and, well, there's not a whole lot of taste. The loaf was heavy, tough, and by no means delicious, but it was quite healthy to sustain the people. The idea was not entirely radical. Cottonseed is very high in protein, and since it was already being fed to animals, it was only a short jump to try it out on humans. Spoiler alert, they could, but at the cost of a little pain. When the options are between cottonseed loaf and nothing, then the cottonseed loaf does not look too bad at all. Moreover, it is a good lesson on how people have to exist with what they have, even if what they have is cotton. Pickled watermelon rinds turned what many would throw away into a sweet, sour preserve that families treasured during the Depression. When fresh fruit was too precious to waste, thrifty homemakers saved the tough white rind of watermelons. These rinds were boiled with sugar, vinegar, and spices until they softened and took on a tangy sweetness. Stored in jars, they became both a condiment and a dessert, brightening up otherwise bland meals. Children loved them for their unexpected flavor, and adults valued how nothing went to waste. Victory gardens often produced watermelons, and in households where money was scarce, even the rinds had value. Pickled watermelon rinds were served alongside beans, bread, or meats when they could be found, making ordinary meals feel more lively. Many families kept recipes for these preserves, passing them down as reminders of how every scrap could be used. The dish was both resourceful and flavorful, embodying the resilience that defined Depression-era cooking. Canned milk corn chowder was a soup that hugged you from the inside. You'd open a can of evaporated milk, pour it into a pot, add a few handfuls of frozen corn and some instant potato flakes, and let it all come together over a low flame. The result was thick, creamy, and comforting, the kind of meal that tasted richer than your wallet said it should. It warmed you up fast and made you feel like you had something special on the stove. This was a dinner for cold nights, small paychecks, and big appetites. Even without bacon or cream, it had depth, thanks to the sweet corn and that canned milk tang. Served with a few crackers or a slice of bread, it made a full meal out of almost nothing. Canned milk corn chowder wasn't just food. It was a reminder that with a pot, a can, and a little patience, you could turn scarcity into comfort. Powdered milk chocolate pudding was the sweet ending that made every tight grocery week feel worth it. You'd mix dry milk with cocoa powder, sugar, cornstarch, and a little water, whisking fast until it came together into a glossy brown dream. It simmered slow on the stove, thickening just enough to coat the spoon. Once it cooled, it went into reused butter tubs or chipped mugs, then straight into the icebox until firm. The first spoonful was pure bliss, smooth, sweet, and just chocolatey enough to make you forget how simple it was. Kids licked the pot clean, laughing at the sticky whisk marks on their fingers. Nobody cared that it wasn't real milk. What mattered was that it felt indulgent. Sometimes you'd top it with whipped cream from a can or a sprinkle of sugar if you wanted to be fancy. It was cheap, it was easy, and it made even the hardest weeks taste soft around the edges. Powdered milk chocolate pudding was proof that sweetness didn't come from money. It came from patience, persistence, and love stirred over a warm stove. Imagine a meal that's as simple as it sounds. Cooked the flour and water and made dumplings. Now, I know you're wondering, that sounds like something you'd make on a sad Tuesday when you have nothing else in the pantry. Well, you're not wrong, but during the Dust Bowl, this was a hearty way to fill up a family when food was so scarce that even the pantry felt empty. The components in this dish were as simple as 1, 2, or 3: flour, water, and a pinch of salt. The dough was then molded into small balls and then placed in boiling water to be cooked. Yes, it was simple, but it was satisfying and had enough carbs to get people through the day. If you were lucky, you could put some herbs or a pinch of whatever spices remained to make it taste better. But mostly it was about existence, not feasting. The beauty of this dish was that it could be made in large batches, and while the flavor may not have been over the top, it could feed a family when they needed it most. The flour was the only real staple many families had, and it became the base for many meals. This simple dumpling dish was an example of how a little could be turned into something more. Mock fish cakes were a thrifty invention for families who longed for seafood but could not afford it during the Depression. Instead of fish, mashed beans or leftover potatoes were seasoned with onions and herbs, then shaped into patties and fried. When browned in a pan, they resembled fish cakes in both texture and appearance, providing the illusion of a more expensive meal. Families often relied on beans because they were cheap, nutritious, and available through relief programs, making them the perfect base for this dish. Some households even added breadcrumbs or stale crackers to stretch the mixture further. While it might not have carried the same flavor as real fish, it was filling and hearty, which mattered most in those years. For many children, mock fish cakes became a familiar supper, remembered later with a mix of humor and nostalgia. They embodied the era's spirit of improvisation, turning simple, humble ingredients into something that felt like a substitute for luxury. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Rolled flank steak was a much less expensive cut of beef. A lot of protein like fish and canned ham were used, but people couldn't really replace the need for beef. Of course, they had to make do. But that meant another thing. Less popular cuts of meat, ones that people normally wouldn't give a second glance to, became a lot more in demand. Naturally, you'd think that would mean they'd raise the prices, right? Not really, because then people would just buy the beef. Flank steak in particular was tougher and a lot more rubbery, but it was also really tender when you would slow cook it. It also helped matters that most home chefs knew their way pretty intimately around slow cooking. Next, you'd do whatever you could to make sure that the beef would last as long as possible. It was usually common to serve rolled flank steak with stuffing to make a pretty neat dish that required minimal beef. The stuffing itself was made from economy loaves, vegetables, and different kinds of herbs. An otherwise small and pretty hard-to-chew piece of meat would become a meal the whole family could look forward to, if you were willing to invest the hours it would take to make something of it. Most people were just happy to eat beef, though, which made the prep work just a bit more bearable. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the Dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Stuffed beet leaves showed how Depression kitchens wasted nothing. not even the leafy tops of common root vegetables. Instead of throwing the greens away, families boiled them briefly to soften and then filled them with small portions of rice, breadcrumbs, or leftover scraps of vegetables. Rolled tightly, they resembled stuffed grape leaves, though much humbler in taste and presentation. Sometimes onions or herbs were added if available, but most of the time they were seasoned simply with salt or vinegar. This dish was especially popular in rural homes where beet crops were plentiful and gardens were a lifeline. Stuffed beet leaves carried a sense of novelty for children who might otherwise turn up their noses at plain greens. Adults valued them for stretching scraps into something that looked and felt more like a real meal. Even in their simplicity, they managed to bring variety to dinner tables that often repeated the same foods day after day. They remain a forgotten reminder of how every single part of a plant had value when survival depended on it. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were the proud invention of leftovers and late nights. You'd open the fridge, see a bowl of yesterday's spaghetti, and realize that bread was the only thing left. So you'd scoop the cold noodles right onto the bread, fold it over, and take a bite. It was messy, chewy, and surprisingly satisfying. The sauce soaked into the bread, turning it into something that didn't need reheating or plating. It became a classic among factory workers, college kids, and tired parents who didn't have the energy to reheat a pan. It might have looked ridiculous, but it worked. It was dinner without dishes. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were proof that comfort food doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make you full. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasized the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. Now people who had chickens as pets had the luxury of eating hard-boiled eggs for breakfast. Let's be honest, we all love a sunny side-up, but hard-boiled eggs just hit differently. This classic breakfast food got a workout during the Dust Bowl. Eggs were a valuable source of protein and could be stored for a longer time. Eggs, when hard-boiled, had a longer shelf life compared to raw eggs. This made them a practical choice for preservation, as they could be stored and used over time without spoiling quickly. Plus, boiling eggs is easy no matter how challenging the times get. They could be sliced into salads, added to casseroles, or simply enjoyed as a snack. These weren't just a breakfast item. These eggs were also used in dinner meals and were often served with white sauce over rice. Have you ever come across those roadkill signs by the side of the road? Well, some people, especially during the Dust Bowl, benefited from those poor animals. Yes, Canned roadkill was a grim but feasible way to feed many destitute farmers out there. You didn't have a butcher or a grocery store. If you saw something fresh on the side of the road, you didn't waste it. Farmers would gather up whatever animals had been hit by cars, squirrels, rabbits, even deer, and can them for future consumption. The process was basic. You'd gut and prepare the animal, put it in a can, and then close the lid. It might sound like something out of a horror movie today, but it was a real source for survival. The meat was loaded with protein and could be stored for long periods of time. Canned roadkill was not a gourmet dish, but it meant that people would not starve to death. Now, I know most people will say they'd rather die than eat roadkill, but honestly, if it were the difference between dying and living, I'd probably be the first one in line for canned rabbit stew. You do what you gotta do! Ritz Cracker Tuna Melt Bake was the definition of 1980s ingenuity, a dinner built from scraps that somehow felt like a feast. You'd mix canned tuna with a spoonful of mayonnaise, maybe stretch it with a little celery or onion if you had it, and spread it into a battered casserole dish. Then came the magic. A blanket of crushed Ritz crackers sprinkled over the top, glistening with butter, and a few slices of processed cheese layered for good measure. When it baked, the edges browned, the middle bubbled, and the smell filled the whole apartment like hope. It looked like luxury, but it was born from frugality. You could feed a whole family on one can of tuna and half a box of crackers and still have leftovers for the next day. Kids fought over the crispy top layer while parents smiled in relief. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, comforting, and rich in all the right ways. This dish didn't just fill plates, it filled the silence that hunger left behind. Ritz Cracker Tuna Melt Bake turned a handful of cheap ingredients into something that tasted like victory after another long, hard day. So you might be surprised to hear Party Franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party Franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party Franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Now, beans were a staple, and pairing them with ham was a Southern favorite. It was a hearty meal that would stick to your ribs. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good bowl of beans and ham hocks? A variation of this was known as the United States Senate bean soup, or simply Senate bean soup, which was a soup made with navy beans, ham hocks, and onion. It was served in the dining room of the United States Senate every day, in a tradition that dates back to the early 20th century. The original version included celery, garlic, and parsley. One of the 2 versions used today includes mashed potatoes. The ham hocks added flavor to the beans, and the whole thing was slow cooked until the meat fell off the bone. It might not have been gourmet, but it was definitely satisfying. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. This is not a joke, but the next thing you will be hearing is peanut butter and onions. Exactly, during the Dust Bowl, people could not afford to use peanut butter in sweet spreads, so they had to make do with what they had, which was to add a savory touch to the sandwiches. The peanut butter and onion sandwich came from the need to have a salty, protein-rich sandwich that has a kick from the onion. Well, this may sound like the most unusual pairing you've ever come across, but the components were basic. A thick layer of peanut butter, onions thinly sliced, and served on any bread that was available. It was a good blend of the creamy, nutty taste of the peanut butter and the sharp, pungent taste of the onions, at least when one is hungry enough to take it. The sandwich may have been a bit of a shock to the taste buds, but it did the trick of providing a quick meal with protein, complex carbohydrates, and fat. Also, it did not cost much and was filling, two important factors during the Dust Bowl. Okay, it may seem strange, but if you had to endure the Dust Bowl, you would not think twice about making a sandwich with peanut butter and onions. It's a rather perverse example of how food innovation thrives under pressure. Oatmeal. Gruel was one of the humblest Depression foods, often reserved for children, the elderly, or the sick. Rolled oats were boiled in water until thin and soupy, sometimes flavored with milk if it could be spared, or a sprinkle of sugar when available. It lacked richness, but it was nourishing and easy to digest, which made it practical when stronger meals were impossible. For many families, oatmeal gruel was served as both breakfast and dinner, stretching a handful of oats across several bowls. Though plain, it provided much-needed energy and warmth in a time when calories were hard to come by. Parents ate less of it themselves, saving portions for their children. While it might not have been anyone's favorite meal, it carried the comfort of something warm in otherwise hungry days. For countless households, oatmeal gruel was both a symbol of hardship and proof of how people endured with the simplest foods. Canned tomato sandwiches were the taste of summer when nothing else was left in the fridge. You'd pop open a can of whole or sliced tomatoes, drain them just enough to stop the bread from falling apart, then slather both slices with mayonnaise. A sprinkle of salt and pepper went on top, maybe a little sugar if you came from the South, and that was lunch done. It was cold, slippery, messy, and perfect all at once. The juice soaked into the bread, softening it until every bite felt like a mix of tang and cream. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it was the one that kept bellies full on long, hot afternoons when money ran out before the month did. Some people added lettuce if they had it. Most didn't bother. It was simple, nostalgic, and surprisingly satisfying. The flavor was sharp, honest, and comforting in a way that no processed meal could be. It didn't matter that it came from a can, it still tasted like home. Every bite told a story of resourcefulness and grace under pressure. For families in the 1980s, canned tomato sandwiches were proof that even the simplest things could feel like love. Lima bean soup is a little different. See, they wanted to scoop up all the grade A stuff, the easy sources of protein. I mean, you'd be pretty right in thinking that includes beans too, and yeah, lots of soldiers ate canned beans and soups made out of various beans. Luckily for everyone, there was, for once, just once during the war, enough to go around most of the country. Lima beans in particular were really popular throughout the Midwest and the South. Let me talk a little about what wartime cooking did for soups, though. While they were never really hurting for love or attention, you couldn't exactly call a bowl of soup the main attraction. Maybe today, in gourmet dining circles, that kind of thing could fly, but back then, there wasn't enough value for money. That quickly changed once people realized soups are actually a lot better all around when you make them at home. I'm not talking about taste, since that was still something people took time to get used to. I'm talking about utility. A soup can be readjusted so many times. It takes literally nothing but water as a base to make, and it can go around an entire large family. That's the kind of thing you hold on to tight during an economic breakdown, and nothing shows that better than lima bean soup. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, And preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work, as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. Stone soup is almost exactly what it sounds like, and it does involve a solid rock being in your soup. But hear us out, it is only temporary. Now, the origin of this term dates back to a European folktale about how two people would come into a town, convince everyone to share a bit of food, and then make a meal for the entire town. Sharing is caring, right? Anyway, the actual technique concerning food is to heat a rock in a fire and then place it in a bowl of soup so that it can cook it. People would add meat trimmings and scraps, plus carrots and cabbage to the soup to give it more nutritional value as well as flavor, and it did more or less work. What the real magic was that it browned the soup, which is something that you could not get in most standard soups people prepared. It also added a much richer flavor overall that was to die for, and people started to adopt the technique as it made soup on a budget much better than normal. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Apple peel jelly was the perfect example of Depression frugality, showing how even scraps could become something sweet. When apples were peeled for pies or other dishes, thrifty homemakers saved the skins rather than discarding them. These peels were boiled with sugar and water, sometimes with a bit of lemon peel, until they turned into a flavorful jelly. The jelly could be spread over bread, crackers, or biscuits, instantly brightening the table. It was not as rich as traditional jams, but for families who had little, it felt like a luxury. Children loved the sweet tang, and parents took pride in knowing nothing went to waste. Apple peel jelly was especially popular in rural areas where orchards were common, and every harvest meant piles of peels waiting to be reused. For families struggling through hunger, it was a reminder that comfort could be coaxed from even the most unlikely ingredients. It became both a necessity and a tradition, keeping hope alive through sweetness. Fried bologna chips were genius, born out of boredom and thrift. You took a slice of bologna, cut it into quarters, and tossed it into a hot skillet until it curled up like bacon and popped around the edges. The smell alone could pull anyone to the kitchen. The sizzling sound was pure comfort, like something important was happening on the stove. A paper towel would soak up the grease, and before long, you'd be snacking on salty, crispy bites that tasted like meat candy. It was perfect for game nights, cheap beer, or payday eves when you wanted something crunchy without opening a bag of chips. Some folks dipped them in mustard, others stacked them between white bread with a smear of mayo. It wasn't fancy, it was food that did its job. Fried bologna chips were the working-class answer to bacon, proof that good flavor didn't need a big budget. It was something to look forward to after a long week, and in its own greasy way, it made life taste a little better. Cherry tomato salads are pretty much just a really refreshing way to utilize your tomatoes. Thanks to Victory Gardens, which was a concept that spread like wildfire, all sorts of people were getting first-hand farming experience. When you get into that sort of thing, you soon realize the prestige of a tomato. It's one of the heaviest hitters when it comes to fruits. If you think I'm overrating it, well, I won't bore you with all the benefits of a tomato, but I will let you in on how easy they are to grow. These things can be grown from February to mid-March outdoors or indoors, in the ground or in a pot. This made them perfect for victory gardens. But tomatoes on their own aren't something you can do a lot with. That's where cherry tomato salads come in. This was a light-hearted, refreshing salad that really put some energy back into you, and it was pretty needed too. After a long day of working in subpar environments and just constantly being in bad living conditions, people's bodies really needed a good salad to jolt them awake. Plus, it always made for a wonderful breakfast. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. Butter and sugar sandwiches were the childhood candy of the broke and content. 2 slices of white bread, a spread of butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. That was dessert. Kids came home from school hungry, opened the pantry, and made these without asking. Sometimes the butter wasn't real butter, but margarine, slick and sweet just the same. It wasn't fancy, but when you bit into it, the crunch of sugar met the softness of bread in the most perfect way. It was cheap joy in the shape of a sandwich, a moment of sweetness when life was rough around the edges. Parents made them too, not just for kids, but for themselves, because a bite of that sugar and butter sandwich tasted like nostalgia. It reminded them that even when the world felt out of reach, they still had bread, sweetness, and a reason to smile. A pretty imaginative way of getting some familiar old flavors back into the weekly diet was mock food, specifically mock fish fillets. We're going to take a look this time at both this recipe and how exactly things like it became common. See, there's one thing about people from back then. While they definitely had it horrible, their circumstances really expanded their horizons in the kitchen. Mock culture was all about mimicking flavors of classic dishes with inexpensive ingredients. Stuff that was easy to get, wouldn't cut too deep into your pockets, and would also last you a good while. Mock fish fillets were actually made out of mashed potatoes. I really wasn't kidding when I said people really grew a newfound appreciation for potatoes. Recipes in cookbooks back then were using them in ways that the curly fries and hash brown-addled brains of you and I could only dream of. Still, there were times when even potatoes weren't available. In that case, they'd make use of bread. Now, you might naturally be wondering how bread even comes close to imitating the flavor of a fish fillet. Well, apparently, soaking it in some milk and mixing it with powdered eggs and flour actually forms a mixture that gets the texture down. Next, your spices: onion, parsley, pepper, and some pretty basic stuff, which was still easy enough to get. Though even those were stretched thin, spice cabinets would often run empty. Do you think this actually does the job? If you try it, share what you thought in the comments below. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Oxtail. The cut of meat that might make you cringe at first, but during the Dust Bowl was a real hero on the table. Aspic, on the other hand, is probably something you haven't thought about since that one time you tried Jell-O salad at a family reunion. However, during the Great Depression, oxtail aspic was a good way of making a few pounds of meat go a long way without having to spend a lot of money. The secret to making oxtail aspic was, of course, the oxtail, which is a cut of meat that is famous for being rather sinewy and full of flavor. When farmers stewed the oxtail for hours, they separated the bones and fat, leaving them with a thick, sticky broth. They would then pour that broth into molds, let it cool and solidify, and there you have it, oxtail aspic, a gelatinous delicacy made from beef. The meat inside would set into the jelly, making it a perfect snack or dish on the side. It wasn't elegant by any means, but oxtail aspic was full of flavor and protein. It was a way of utilizing a cheap cut of meat and getting the best out of it as possible. Oxtail aspic might be the most underrated dish of survival cooking. Molasses water was one of the simplest Depression-era energy boosters, and it carried a surprising amount of cultural weight. White sugar was often scarce and costly, but molasses was cheaper and packed with minerals like iron, which people desperately needed. Families would stir a spoonful of molasses into a glass of water, creating a sweet, dark drink that was both energizing and inexpensive. Children drank it before heading to school, and workers often relied on it to get through long hours of labor. It tasted strong, sometimes too strong for delicate palates, but its sweetness made it more welcome than plain water. Molasses water was also used as a quick fix when other drinks like milk or coffee were out of reach. For many rural families, it became a symbol of thrift and nourishment, stretching the value of every ingredient. It was not a luxury or even a treat. It was a necessity, one that reminded people of the importance of resourcefulness. In its simplicity, molasses water reflects how people created sustenance out of almost nothing and carried on despite hardship. Hot dog fried rice was the 1980s answer to fast food when nobody could afford the drive-thru. You'd grab the leftover rice from the night before, toss it into a skillet, and chop up a few hot dogs to throw in. The soy sauce packets saved from cheap takeout finally earned their keep, sizzling as they hit the pan. The smell filled every corner of the kitchen, salty and smoky with a little sweetness from the rice. If you had an egg, you'd crack it right in and stir fast, watching it turn the whole thing golden. If you didn't, no one complained. The hot dogs carried enough flavor to make it feel like a real meal. It looked humble, but it tasted like triumph. Families made it at the end of the week when groceries ran low, and somehow it always hit the spot. It stretched scraps into dinner, turned leftovers into pride, and reminded everyone that creativity was just as filling as wealth. Kids didn't know it was poverty food. To them, it was comfort on a plate. Hot dog fried rice was the flavor of resilience, sizzling proof that even struggle could taste good if you knew how to fry it right. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. If you ask someone to name one dish that describes diets during the Dust Bowl era, bean soup is the first meal that comes to mind. Beans have been man's best friend through some of the tensest times in history. They've been used in different kinds of meals through thick and thin. Bean soup was the classic bean dish of the 30s. Beans were cheap and easy to store, so they were a staple in many pantries. Bean soup could be made with any type of bean, and it was often thickened with cornmeal or bread. The simplicity of bean soup meant that it could be stretched to feed many people, and it provided a good source of protein and fiber. Bean soup might not have been the most exciting dish, but it was a staple of the Dust Bowl diet for a reason. It provided essential nutrition, was easy to make, and offered a bit of comfort and warmth. It was a reliable and nurturing meal that helped families get through some of the toughest times. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Radish sandwiches were a common rural Depression-era meal born of the simplest garden ingredients. Bread was often homemade, and radishes were among the easiest vegetables to grow quickly. Thin slices of radish were salted and layered between two pieces of bread, making a sharp, peppery sandwich that cost next to nothing. Sometimes butter or lard was spread on the bread if available, but often it was just radishes and salt. Children sometimes found the taste too strong, but adults appreciated the freshness and crunch. These sandwiches were portable, cheap, and filling enough to be eaten in the fields or at school. Families often remembered them not as a treat, but as a symbol of survival, proof that even the humblest vegetables had value. Radish sandwiches may have been plain, but they were deeply tied to the memory of Depression-era gardens and the resilience they represented. They carried with them the taste of both hardship and hope. Butterbean burgers were the quiet champions of the broke man's dinner table, turning pantry scraps into something worth savoring. You'd start with a can of butter beans, mash them until smooth, and mix in breadcrumbs, an egg, and a pinch of salt and pepper. When fried, the patties crisped up perfectly, the edges golden brown and the centers creamy like mashed potatoes. The beans brought a rich, earthy flavor that made you forget there wasn't any meat involved. You could serve them on bread with mustard, stack them like real burgers, or eat them straight from the skillet with a fork. They filled you up fast and cost next to nothing, a miracle in itself. Families loved how far one could go, and kids didn't mind because they tasted good. It was one of those rare recipes that started from desperation but stayed for its flavor. Butterbean burgers proved that meat wasn't the only thing that made a meal feel whole. They were born from necessity but carried pride, the sound of sizzling oil marking another night conquered. Poverty taught people to adapt, but these burgers taught them to thrive. This next one is sautéed liver with tomato sauce. Okay, I get it. No one's that big of a fan of liver. I wouldn't blame you because, to be honest, I can't really get with it either. Actually, the government wouldn't blame you either, because they're the same. Not sure what I mean? Rationing efforts were actually decided by what seems to be a group of picky eaters. Remember how, when we were talking about rolled flank steak, we went over the fact that it was a less popular cut of meat? That was true for like a million other things. Rationing efforts focused most on premium cuts of meat, fresh produce, and popular vegetables. The stuff that wasn't so up to quality was left behind for the people. I guess it kind of makes sense, but also, wouldn't you be happy to get whatever meat you could during a war? That's definitely how the people back at home felt. Thanks to all of this, liver became insanely more popular. A lot of people realized the health benefits of it and how nutritious it was, and began using it in their daily diet. I guess you really can acquire any taste. Would you give liver a fair shot today? Or is that a little past our comfort zone? Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings, it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the Mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. Supper sub. Avocado toast? That's not what life was like during the Dust Bowl. People were eating cactus fruit and spreading lard. Now you might be wondering, what on earth is a cactus fruit? Well, think of it as nature's candy. These spiny little fruits, also called cactus pears or prickly pears, were produced by cacti and turned into an important staple during the worst days of the Dust Bowl. These spiny wonders would be gathered, skinned, and the sweet and sour pulp could be eaten. Now here's where things get interesting. They didn't just eat cactus fruit by itself. No, sir. Farmers needed to add more substance to it, and that's where lard comes in. Lard, the rendered pig fat that many farm families kept in their pantry. So, they would beat the cactus fruit with a generous dollop of lard, and they could spread it on bread, crackers, or anything that was eatable at that time. It wasn't fancy, but it fed people. Well, yes, it might sound a little strange now, but cactus fruit contained vitamins and water, which was scarce. Well, it goes without saying that where there is a will, there is a way. And this combo is a perfect example of that. Salted popcorn supper might sound like a snack today, but during the Depression it often stood in for a real meal. Popcorn was inexpensive, easy to make in large quantities, and filling enough to take the edge off hunger. Families would pop big bowls of it, sprinkle salt over the top, and gather around to share it for dinner. While it lacked the nutrition of meat or vegetables, it was a warm, shared experience that brought families together. Children saw it as a treat, while adults knew it was simply necessity disguised as fun. Sometimes popcorn was paired with milk or molasses water to add substance, but often it stood on its own. Neighbors also used popcorn suppers at gatherings, stretching limited food to feed a crowd. The dish represents how families redefined what supper meant when resources were at their lowest. It was proof that even the humblest food could provide comfort when eaten together, turning scarcity into moments of connection and shared resilience. Mustard greens spaghetti was a Southern experiment that worked better than it had any right to. You'd boil spaghetti noodles, toss them in a pan with wilted mustard greens, and hit it with a dash of hot sauce for punch. The greens were bitter, the pasta plain, but somehow it came together into something hearty and bold. It was the perfect marriage of Italian thrift and Southern grit. Some folks added a spoonful of margarine to mellow the greens. Others went heavy on the spice to make it sing. It was an accidental recipe that spread through kitchens where fresh produce was rare and creativity was required. Mustard greens spaghetti might sound strange to anyone who didn't live through lean years, but for those who did, it was genius. It filled your stomach and left you proud you'd made something out of almost nothing. It was humble food with heart, and that made it better than any restaurant plate. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Mayonnaise and tomato saltines were what passed for luxury when the lights were dim and the pantry looked bare. You'd take a sleeve of saltines, smear each one with a bit of mayonnaise, then press on a slice of tomato fresh from a neighbor's garden or the grocery discount bin, sprinkle a little salt, maybe pepper if you had it, and you were set. Folks called them poor man's canapés, but they tasted like victory after a long day. It was the kind of snack you made barefoot at the kitchen counter with a glass of sweet tea sweating beside you. Kids thought it looked strange, but always came back for another bite because it hit that perfect balance between creamy, salty, and sharp. You could find families across the South and Midwest doing the same thing late at night, catching reruns on television with a paper towel full of saltines in hand. There was no need for fine dining or silver spoons, just a little mayonnaise, a ripe tomato, and something cold to drink. It wasn't just a snack. It was a reminder that the simplest things could feel fancy when you needed them to. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s, though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put two and two together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. For every great food substitute out there is always a terrible one out there as well. One of the more eccentric replacements was turnip coffee. Yes, you read that right, turnips instead of coffee beans during the Dust Bowl. At some point, coffee became too expensive or scarce and people had to improvise, and turnips became the new hero. The process included roasting turnips, grinding them to resemble coffee, and boiling them to make a drinkable concoction. Yes, it was not as delicious as the real coffee, but it was warm, It contained caffeine, sort of, and people got that extra dose of energy they needed. Moreover, it was not nearly as expensive as the real thing. It is hard to believe today, but turnip coffee was a great idea to solve a significant issue at that time. Turnips were easy to grow, they were abundant, and they could satisfy that hunger that comes with the loss of a beloved caffeinated beverage. Frankly, I'd like to try it only for the sake of trying it, but I guess I would need some really powerful cream to make it all possible. It's probably one of the most unique ways to get your coffee intake for the day, though. Cornmeal dumplings in broth were one of those Depression-era tricks that turned the most modest soup into something that felt like a meal. Flour and wheat were often expensive, but cornmeal remained relatively cheap and widely available. Families would mix cornmeal with water and a little salt to form a simple dough, shaping it into small balls and dropping them into a pot of thin broth. The broth itself could be made from vegetable scraps, meat bones, or even just salted water, but once the dumplings simmered and swelled, the dish felt hearty. Mothers often relied on this trick to stretch a single pot into enough servings for large families. Children loved the dumplings because they had a soft, chewy texture, almost like a treat floating in their soup. Adults valued the filling quality, which helped stave off hunger when no second helpings were possible. Cornmeal dumplings showed the ingenuity of turning something inexpensive and basic into comfort food. In many households, this dish became a staple, remembered later not for its luxury, but for the way it managed to make empty cupboards feel just a little less empty. Instant oatmeal muffins were breakfast alchemy at its absolute finest, a miracle born out of leftovers and imagination. You'd empty a few packets of flavored oatmeal, apple, cinnamon, maple, or whatever was left, into a mixing bowl, crack in an egg, add a splash of milk, and stir until it looked close enough to real batter. The texture wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. You'd pour it into greased muffin tins and bake it just long enough for the kitchen to fill with the smell of brown sugar and comfort. Moms picked up the trick from neighbors, TV ads, or recipe clippings taped to the fridge. 2 oatmeal packets could somehow stretch into 6 muffins, and that was magic in itself. They came out soft, warm, and sweet, just right for little hands on their way to school. Raisins made them feel fancy, chocolate chips made them feel like dessert, and even plain they hit every craving. Instant oatmeal muffins weren't about showing off, they were about showing love with whatever you had. They were the kind of breakfast that didn't look like struggle, it looked like care. For families trying to stretch the grocery bill one more week, that was everything. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? If you believe that eating insects is a modern sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke, they were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, Farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Rutabaga hash was a clever dish that made the most of rutabagas, which were cheaper and more plentiful than potatoes during the Depression. Families would chop the firm root into small cubes, frying it with onions and whatever fat they could find. The rutabaga softened and browned, giving a texture and taste that mimicked potatoes closely enough to satisfy hungry families. Sometimes scraps of bacon or ham were added for flavor, but more often it was just the vegetables alone. The hash was hearty, filling, and adaptable, often appearing at both breakfast and dinner tables. Since rutabagas grew well in harsh conditions, they were dependable crops when potatoes ran short. Many children grew up not realizing their parents had been serving them substitutes, because the crispy fried cubes tasted so much like the real thing. Rutabaga hash showed how families made necessity feel normal, turning cheap vegetables into meals that could carry them through some of the hardest years in memory. Ritz Cracker chicken coating turned every oven into a poor man's fryer and every Sunday night into a feast worth waiting for. You'd crush up a full sleeve of buttery Ritz crackers inside a plastic bag until they were fine and crumbly, then roll chicken legs, thighs, or even drumsticks through a bowl of beaten eggs before covering them completely in the crumbs. Once they hit the oven, the smell alone could fill the house with the promise of something good. The crackers browned just right, trapping all the juices inside the chicken and creating a golden crust that was crisp, savory, and rich without needing oil or a deep fryer. It was crunchy on the outside, tender in the middle, and budget-friendly all the way through. Families loved it because it felt like fried chicken night without the cleanup or cost. Even neighbors could smell it through the windows and knew someone was eating well. It was the kind of dish you could bring to a church supper and proudly pass off as something special. Ritz Cracker chicken coating wasn't just about saving money. It was about finding flavor where others saw leftovers. It was thrift at its finest, and nobody complained about seconds. Wartime living during World War II really shows you how much people worked with so little. During the war, butter and margarine were rationed pretty extensively too. That basically meant your local diet had a big void where fats should be, and that wasn't good for anyone. You'd need that stuff to cook or bake and just to get on with your week. Dripping was people's easy, one-stop solution to this crisis. When you'd roast meat, you'd get drippings from it. This wasn't just used once, but again and again as many times as possible. Pork or beef fat is another term for dripping, and it's still used in places today. But during the war, every home was working like this. There was such a strong mentality of not letting even a single part of an animal go to waste, and that didn't just include the meat and bones, but also the fat. I guess it's pretty admirable how much the brain can think of when you find yourself in situations like this. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Imagine a world without fancy desserts or indulgent snacks. Well, that pretty much sums up the Dust Bowl era for you. Enter milk toast, which was one of the only sweet treats offered in the 30s. Milk toast was a breakfast dish consisting of toasted bread and warm milk, typically with sugar and butter. Some fancier variations included salt, pepper, paprika, cinnamon, cocoa, and raisins. Milk toast was a popular food throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially for young children. Now, this was the first choice for those feeling under the weather back in the day. Yeah, it was the classic sick people food of the Dust Bowl era. Often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar, milk toast was a gentle food that was easy on the stomach. When the chips are down, you have to work with what you have left in the kitchen or pantry. During the Dust Bowl, that creativity resulted in a dish like bird egg soufflé, a name that sounds like a fancy dinner party, but the reality was that it was a way to make the most out of very little. Bird eggs were one of the few sources of protein after the agricultural collapse that is depicted in the novel. The name soufflé may give one an idea that it is some light, airy French delicacy. This was not the case with the dish. The bird eggs, probably quail, chicken, or any other small bird eggs, were beaten and then cooked with whatever was available like cornmeal or flour to make it more filling. It was not about making it perfect, it was about making it edible. The soufflé was then baked, and you had a fluffy though rather plain meal to get you through the day. Eggs, being rich in protein, were a vital resource during the Dust Bowl. They could be prepared in different ways, scrambled, baked, or fried. Thus, a bird egg soufflé may not be a five-star meal, but it could certainly give one the strength to go through a tough day on the farm. Would I eat it? Heck, yes. Who does not like a dish that involves eggs and ingenuity? Even if it is not a sophisticated soufflé that can be ordered in a French restaurant. Peanut butter bread pudding was the dessert you made when every sweet thing in the house was gone, but no one wanted to end dinner on an empty note. You'd tear up old bread, pour over a mix of milk, sugar, and a few spoonfuls of peanut butter, then bake until the top turned golden and sticky. The smell filled the house like a warm blanket. It was thick, sweet, and rich enough to make you forget how cheap it was. No one wasted bread back then. It was too precious. If you had bananas or raisins, you could toss those in, but most times it was just bread, milk, and peanut butter working overtime. Families made it in square pans or cast iron skillets, serving it hot with a drizzle of syrup if they were lucky. It wasn't a fancy dessert, but it was one that made you close your eyes with that first bite. Peanut butter bread pudding was poor folks' decadence, a taste of comfort that didn't cost a dime extra. Inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for, but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Breaded tomato slices were a Depression-era favorite when green or underripe tomatoes were all that gardens could spare. Rather than waste them, families would slice the tomatoes thick, dip them in a little cornmeal or flour, and fry them until golden. The result was crisp on the outside, tangy inside, and surprisingly satisfying. Sometimes salt or pepper was added, but often they were served plain, still managing to feel like a treat in households where luxuries were rare. This dish became especially popular in rural areas where families grew their own produce and needed creative ways to use every part of the harvest. Children enjoyed the crunch, and adults valued how it stretched a small supply of vegetables into something filling. Breaded tomato slices became both a side dish and sometimes even a main meal, depending on how scarce other foods were. They reflected both thrift and resourcefulness, proving that even unripe produce could be transformed into comfort food. Cheesewater soup might sound pitiful at first, but to families scraping by, it was survival disguised as comfort. When the pantry was empty, the milk long gone, and payday still days away, a spoonful of powdered cheese stirred into boiling water was enough to lift spirits. The steam carried the smell of warmth, even if the meal itself was little more than wishful thinking. Parents whisked it fast so the powder would melt smooth, creating the illusion of a creamy broth. A few shakes of pepper or a torn piece of stale bread on the side turned it into a full supper. Kids didn't question it. They called it cheese soup and slurped it proudly. It was salty, thin, and simple, but it filled the belly and soothed the mind. For adults, it was less about flavor and more about dignity, proof that even when the cupboards were bare, there was still something to feed the family. Cheesewater soup wasn't a dish people bragged about making, but everyone who lived through hard times remembered it. It was the taste of perseverance poured into a chipped bowl, reminding everyone that even the humblest meal could feel like home. Prune Whip was one of the Depression's simplest yet most surprising desserts. Prunes, being affordable and long-lasting, became a pantry staple, especially in rural areas. To make Prune Whip, stewed prunes were mashed and folded into whipped egg whites, creating a fluffy, airy dessert that felt far richer than its ingredients suggested. Sweetened with a little sugar if available, it became a favorite treat for children who rarely saw sweets at all. Parents valued it for stretching a small amount of fruit into enough dessert for the whole family. Served in bowls or even glasses, Prune Whip looked fancy, adding a sense of celebration to otherwise plain meals. It was often reserved for Sundays or special occasions, giving families something to look forward to. Though forgotten today, Prune Whip symbolized Depression-era ingenuity, turning a single affordable fruit into a dessert that carried joy. In the toughest of years, it proved that even hardship could be softened with sweetness. Yes, you heard it here first, Skunk Stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. Oatmeal patties came from mornings when waste was unthinkable and every leftover had a second act. Cold oatmeal from breakfast would be mixed with an egg, maybe some flour, and fried up like pancakes in a sizzling pan. They crisped on the outside and stayed soft in the middle, smelling faintly of cinnamon or whatever sugar you'd stirred in before. It was the kind of breakfast that made sense in tight times. You already had it, so why not make it better? You could spread a little syrup on top or just eat it plain, standing at the stove with the spatula still in your hand. Kids didn't complain. They thought it was new, not recycled. Families who grew up poor never forgot oatmeal patties because they represented something special, making the most of what was left. Even when money got better, you'd find people still frying them up out of habit. The golden edges, the smell of butter, the sizzle, it was breakfast reborn. Turnip greens were a common green leafy vegetable during the Dust Bowl when other greens like spinach and lettuce were a rare sight. I guess you can say crops had seen better days, so turnips were cooked down with a little bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. They were often cooked down with a bit of bacon grease or other fat to add flavor and make them more palatable. Whether served as a side dish, added to soups, or mixed into stews, turnip greens help to round out meals and provide essential nutrients. Turnip greens might not be everyone's favorite, but they were a necessary part of the Dust Bowl diet. You may think of weed as something you don't want in your garden, but during the Dust Bowl, it was the only thing that could keep people alive. Weed and root stew was another dish that families who were surviving on the edge of starvation could afford, which meant even the most unappetizing plants could save lives. This stew was full of wild greens, dandelions, lamb's quarters, purslane, things you dig up in the garden with your fingers. The stew was not gourmet, but it was filling. The weeds and roots were boiled in water with whatever scrap of meat or bone one could come across. A piece of chicken that had been used the previous day or some beef if one were lucky. The trick was to make it filling, and wild greens can do that. The taste was not gourmet, but hearty. It would not be a restaurant of the stars, but a restaurant of the gut. The roots were sometimes starchy, which was good enough for making a soup. Although calling it weed might not exactly make your mouth water today, wild plants were a great source of vitamins and minerals, much more than that yellowing lettuce in the back of the fridge. Would I eat it? Frankly, if I were in the Dust Bowl, I'd take that weed stew and turn it into my gourmet dish. It is evidence that when it comes to seasoning, desperation is the best thing. Milk toast was one of the humblest but most beloved comfort foods of the Depression. Families would toast slices of bread, often stale or homemade, and soak them in warm milk flavored with sugar or a pinch of salt. The softened bread took on a custard-like texture that children especially enjoyed, while adults valued its warmth and simplicity. Milk toast was often served for breakfast or supper when cupboards were bare, providing a soothing, filling option that used ingredients most homes had on hand. It was easy to digest, which also made it a common food for the elderly and the sick. In households where milk was scarce, families watered it down, making it stretch further while still preserving the spirit of the dish. Milk toast was never glamorous, but it carried the weight of familiarity and comfort, reminding people that even the plainest foods could feel nurturing. It is remembered today not for extravagance, but for the quiet reassurance it gave in the hardest times. Canned pineapple sandwiches were the kind of sweet and savory mystery that only the 1980s could have invented. You'd take 2 slices of plain white bread, spread mayonnaise on both sides, and add a shiny yellow ring of canned pineapple straight from the tin. Sometimes people added a sprinkle of salt or a dash of chili powder, but most kept it simple: soft bread, creamy mayo, and the sharp sweetness of fruit. The pineapple juice would soak through the bread just enough to make it sticky and tender. It was a strange combination that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow it did. Families who couldn't afford lunch meat still had a way to make something that tasted like effort. The contrast of tangy and smooth, salty and sugary made it oddly addictive. Kids might roll their eyes at first, but one bite usually turned into 2. It was the kind of meal made when paychecks came late and grocery lists ran short, and yet it still managed to feel cheerful. Canned pineapple sandwiches became a quirky comfort across small towns and big cities alike, reminding everyone that even strange pairings can taste like hope. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular, as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Onions are one of the most common ingredients in many dishes, but during the Dust Bowl, nothing was wasted, not even the outer skin of the onions. I might have thought baked onion skins were something I would throw in the garbage disposal today, but they were a delicacy back then. Farmers would save the skins of the onions used in preparing dinner and then roast them with a pinch of salt and oil, and they turned out delicious. The skins, after roasting, became a sort of a chip. Well, it did not taste like the real onion ring that we have today, but it was crispy, salty, and made of ingredients that were easily obtainable, or, as we would call it today, the Dust Bowl version of a chip snack. Onions were fairly affordable, and it was a good way not to waste anything since they were simple to cultivate. Besides, they were full of antioxidants and other nutrients that could compensate for the absence of other more healthy foods. If baked onion skins were good enough to sustain life, they might be good enough for me. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Rice croquettes were a depression trick for turning yesterday's leftovers into something new and appetizing. When rice was cooked in large batches, families often had more than they could finish, and waste was simply not an option. Leftover rice was mashed together with a bit of flour or egg when available, then shaped into small balls and fried in a skillet with fat or drippings. The result was a golden, crispy outside and a soft, chewy inside that children especially loved. Adults appreciated how croquettes added texture and flavor to meals that were otherwise bland. They could be served with gravy, broth, or just eaten plain, offering flexibility depending on what was on hand. In some households, croquettes became the centerpiece of dinner when no meat was available. They proved that resourcefulness in the kitchen could transform scraps into something enjoyable. Families remembered rice croquettes not just as a thrifty dish, but as a rare moment when leftovers felt special instead of repetitive. They were simple, but in hard times, simplicity was often the best comfort of all. If these Depression-era meals stirred even one memory, drop your own in the comments and tap like and subscribe so we can keep the stories cooking.